Hello, you're watching the Sunday Politics for Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Coming up today, meet the floating voters. Should we follow the Dutch example and radically rethink the way we tackle the threat from flooding? And as Labour prepares to publish the findings of a report into its election defeat, some in the party warn it faces losing more voters to UKIP in our part of the world. Our guest today is Sarah Champion, Labour MP for Rotherham, and Rishi Sunak, Conservative MP for Richmond. That's Richmond in Yorkshire, of course, not the other one. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Well, a busy week in the world of politics. What's on your radar? Sarah Champion.
Well, the thing I'm most excited about is on Tuesday I'm going to be launching my campaign to try and prevent abuse. It's called Dare to Care, because I've got really frustrated in the 3 years I've been an MP that we seem to have almost accepted that child abuse is inevitable, and it's not. We can prevent it, and Dare to Care is going to try and do that.
I know a lot of work's gone into that. We'll keep an eye on that, of course. Rishi Sunak, what's on your agenda?
Well, exciting for me, I've been drawn to ask the Prime Minister a question in Prime Minister's Question Time on Wednesday, so I'm just mulling over what I might ask him, and I've been spending a lot of time actually on Catterick Garrison, which people don't often know is in my constituency and the largest UK military base in Europe, and a lot of military issues that I have to deal with, and I'm thinking about asking the Prime Minister about the importance of our armed forces and, you know, continued investment in them.
Have people stopped calling you the new William Hague yet?
Well, William was in Parliament for 26 odd years, so I'm not sure that will ever go. But it's a wonderful example to have to live up to, so I'll plug away at it.
Well, as the clean-up continues across Yorkshire, David Cameron said this week that Britain needs a major change of attitude to flood protection. One country that leads the way on flood defences is Holland, which spends far more on protecting its citizens than we do, and has some innovative ways of keeping water at bay, as Paul Murphy has been finding out.
Water dominates this landscape. Around a quarter of the Netherlands lies below sea level. It supports a thriving economy, but also brings an ever-present threat of flooding, though the Dutch are the masters of adapting to this challenge.
This is the most important thing. It's the pillar that anchors it on its place, you know. When the
Ellen is showing me her floating home. When the floodwaters come, as they do so often here, this 3-bedroomed house literally rises above the problem.
The house rises up to a certain level, and then the water goes over the dike, you know. So the garden, you won't be able to see the garden anymore. But the water goes over the dike, and you don't have to be afraid for being flooded.
There are more than 40 amphibious homes here in the floodplain of the River Maas. They are anchored on dry land, but when the waters rise, they are designed to lift by up to 18 feet. The simple philosophy behind these homes is that you work with the water and not against it. In a low-lying country where river and sea levels are continuing to rise, that sort of thinking is becoming increasingly important.
The same gales that laid waste so much of Britain have taken an even greater toll of property and life in Holland.
In the tidal surge of 1953, thousands lost their lives here when defences were overwhelmed. And it was this tragedy which eventually led to a change in flood defence policy.
A strong driver for that new policy was the belief that we cannot control nature and that we have to live with uncertainties. So we have to have a system in place which does not rely only on flood defences, but that we also should take into account that those systems may fail.
The story in York and Leeds at Christmas, or even Hull 9 years earlier, is about that same infrastructure failure. And the calls for a new approach to living in areas of flood risk are perhaps inevitable.
Should we be frightened of living on floodplains? No, we shouldn't be frightened of living on floodplains, but we need to be clear about not being frightened and how we're going to develop those. So if we know that we have a floodplain, we look to develop on it, but we don't look to put regular, ordinary brick-built houses. Put a house on that's on a floating raft.
Do you think we're going to see more development like this in the future?
Yeah, I'm sure, yeah. I think they will build many more houses like this, yeah. You can put your boat in front of your house, you know, next to your house, and not being afraid when the flood comes, you know, then the water might rise once in several years, and then you are safe here.
The Dutch believe they have the best flood defence system in the world. But floating homes reflect the new mindset here, an acceptance that the water is always going to win, something many towns and cities in the UK already know to their cost.
Paul Murphy with that report. Rishi Sunak, of course, the Netherlands spends a much greater percentage of its national income on flood defences. Should we be doing the same?
Well, look, we are doing more. I think we're going to be spending over £2 billion in this Parliament on flood defences. That's more than we spent in the last Parliament and more than we spent in the Parliament before that. So money's going up. But I think what we actually need to do is have a root and branch rethink of how we're spending that money and what we're spending it on. I'm a member of the Environment Rural Affairs Select Committee. We're going to be looking at this and giving our thoughts to the government. And there's a few areas already that suggest themselves. I mean, the Dutch came to the UK after the Somerset flooding, and one of the things that they said to us was you must dredge rivers. And we've gone away from dredging rivers. That's something I think we should look at again. Obviously, we need to look at things like natural flood defences. Pickering in North Yorkshire was in the national news for building things called leaky dams, which are not traditional but can work very effectively. And lastly, farmers. We pay farmers to compensate them for land that's lost. Perhaps we should be incentivising to actually take flood water onto their land to stop it flooding into homes and ruining communities. So there's all different ideas that I think need to be considered, because this is terrible. It affects people's lives and we must get it right.
Sarah Champion, are we looking here at what could be described as a wholesale culture change? Because successive governments have spent money in reaction to flood events, but shouldn't we be looking at a strategy that goes beyond the 5-year cycle of parliaments?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. We ought to be looking much more holistically both at solutions. So, I mean, the floating homes obviously works in Holland, but in our country we've got some of the world's best engineers, the best architects, the best creative minds. So I'm sure that we can come up with similarly creative solutions. It's not so much looking forward 30 years, it's looking back probably a couple of 100 years and learning from the practices, what were farmers doing then in relation to having floodplains, dredging the rivers, how were they managing? So, for example, having much smaller fields, so there was sort of less runoff. Also looking at how the road system, how the pavement system is preventing the land doing what it's meant to be doing and absorbing some of this rainwater. Yes, obviously, the financial investment is key in that, but it's also owning up when we've made mistakes. I mean, at Prime Minister's questions last week, Jeremy Corbyn asked the Prime Minister about cutting investment. He was adamant that he didn't, and now it's become very clear that that's actually happened, and that's happened on the project that was going to be protecting Leeds, and we've seen the consequences of that. So we need to be realistic about where we've gone wrong.
Well, you mentioned dredging. I mean, out of the Environment Agency's flood protection budget, which is around £800 million, only £20 million is spent on dredging. Isn't that an example of actually where prevention can be far better than cure?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I've asked the Environment Agency to increasingly publish those numbers so we know how much they're dredging, what they're spending.
But the government has to put pressure on the Environment Agency here, doesn't it?
Yes, and we've already actually done that, and they are going to start publishing those figures. But just this point about funding, and I think it is important to note, the last Labour government left a plan for capital investment, the Alistair Darling plan. In that budget, the capital plans were going to be cut 50%. I mean, that was a plan that the coalition government we inherited last time around.
And you cut it by 27%.
Absolutely not. I mean, actually, it went up. As I said,
in
flooding.
The first year of the coalition government, they cut the Environment Agency's funds by 27%. They've cut staff by 20%.
Well, if you look at actually what's been invested in flood defences over the last Parliament, it was £1.7 billion. That's an increase on real terms on the 1.5 that was spent in the 5 years before that, and that's going up to over £2 billion in this Parliament. So, without question, the facts tell you, Parliament on Parliament, year on year, there's increased investment going into flood defences. As I said, I think we both agree we need to look holistically at how we're spending that money. And you mentioned, going back hundreds of years, and I think that's absolutely right. I think local communities often hold the key, and we need to make sure the Environment Agency is not this remote bureaucracy. It needs to listen to local communities, talk to local farmers.
Rather than taking a pop at Labour and sort of arguing what percentage of increase you've made, maybe we should be looking at what we actually need to make the changes rather than, who spent more. Because I'm quite sure that your constituents and many across sort of the do Yorkshire and Humber, don't care if it's 2 billion or 7 billion. They care that they can't live in their home for the next couple of years.
And that's exactly what is happening right now. I mean, the Prime Minister's been very clear. We will look at absolutely everything. I mean, this is a tragedy. It's affecting people's lives and their homes. We need to get it right. And whenever we've had something like we've just had, we need to all go and see what worked and what didn't work and where do we need to learn the lessons.
And we shall keep analysing the government's reaction to flood events, no doubt. But on Tuesday, senior Labour figures will discuss an internal report into the party's general election defeat. Some, including the Barnsley MP Dan Jarvis, are calling for that report to be made public. Now, Labour strategists may want to look closely at this article, which was published in the Fabian Review. It warns the party faces losing many of its natural supporters in Yorkshire to UKIP on a scale that could perhaps mirror Labour's losses to the SNP in Scotland. Liz Roberts reports.
Hexthorpe in central Doncaster, a Labour constituency since its creation. Some may say the party's position here is safe as houses. But the homes here have been getting new occupants, and now in this cafe there's a burning issue.
Well, I think it's very important, not just to me, but to everybody, that they need to do something about this immigration laws and that. And, you know, control it more. They don't know who's coming in, who's not. There's just far too many.
An influx of migrants to this part of Doncaster has been causing tensions. There have been demonstrations and counter-demonstrations. And it's this issue, living with the consequences of us having open borders across Europe, that people say Labour aren't listening to.
Jane Maria Collins.
It's seen some voters turn to this party.
11,414 votes.
It may not be the victory they were looking for, but UKIP came second to Labour in more than 2/3 of South Yorkshire's constituencies in the general election. Ed Miliband's Doncaster North constituency is dotted with former mining communities like this one here in Adwick. And while the former Labour leader may have comfortably held on to his seat, the UKIP share of the vote went up by nearly 20%, a figure other political parties would dream of.
When all the Labour bigwigs were around the table, the MPs, I've seen happier-looking bloodhounds. They were so...
And no one sums up their growing support more than these brothers. Former Labour voters, one now a UKIP councillor, the other his election agent and lifelong union member.
I was a supporter of John Smith. I mean, when John Smith died, I believe the Labour Party died, in my opinion. They've lost the trust of your common Gordon person, the working man like we are. The Labour Party, when it had sense and when it had decent politicians who knew what they were talking about, was against the EU because they said it would cause wage compression and unskilled people coming to this country and causing problems, and it has done.
Immigration, no problem with it at all.
No qualms at all.
They should have the skill, they should bring the skills the country needs.
Control the immigration.
Another general election may be a long way off, but round the corner is a referendum on Europe, and that's a worry.
We can't afford at a national, regional and local level to be complacent. They still are organising, they still have a degree of popular support. The EU referendum will give them the biggest platform that they've ever had. So I think it is very important that we take the threat seriously, that we think long and hard about the reasons why people, in some cases, and in some of our traditional heartlands, are favourable to UKIP.
In fact, writing in the Fabian Society, one Yorkshireman, now a Labour councillor based in London, says his party should learn lessons from Scotland.
You had the referendum and you had the Labour Party siding with all the other parties apart from one, and suddenly, despite winning the referendum, they lost the post-referendum period. And I think you could see that quite easily happening in parts of Yorkshire around the EU referendum.
Labour has already lost these 2 votes. The party will now be hoping its in-campaign won't see it out of the running in future elections.
Sarah Champion, do you think Labour is in danger of losing many of its natural supporters across Yorkshire?
It's a good question. If you listen to UKIP, yes, we're sort of completely crumbling and, you know, we're going to be wiped out in Yorkshire. If you actually look at the facts, it's a very different picture. So take my constituency of Rotherham. We were told by UKIP that we were going to lose all of the seats, whereas actually the 3 sitting MPs increased their majority. So I think we need to be somewhat realistic, but not complacent. You know, we lost a number of councillors. We lost to a number of sort of key areas which I would have hoped in my constituency we held on to. And I think that doing the review is the most important thing for us, because we don't, you know, we learn by our mistakes.
Because UKIP came second in 14 Labour constituencies at the general election, but only in 5 Conservative constituencies across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. So you have the most to lose here, don't you?
Absolutely, but we also need to start listening to people and find out why it was. You know, when I've sort of analysed in my constituency, the reason that we lost some councillors was because of sort of specific issues. So we need to be getting on top of those and see, you know, is this actually on national issues that people are moving from one party to another, or is it on local? And for what I'm finding, it tends to be on a very sort of local protest vote, and we need to analyse that and make sure that we don't lose any more, because it pains me that you see those 2 gentlemen who, you know, as they rightly said, they're sort of hard-working, they were Labour voters, and we've lost them. So why has that happened? What can we do? And I personally think it's about talking to people and, most importantly, listening to people and changing what we do to reflect that.
Rishi Sunak, which side will you be on when it comes to the EU referendum?
Well, I think our relationship with Europe needs some major reform. So, you know, hopefully the Prime Minister will be able to secure that reform when he comes back from the European Council in February. But I think part of that reform does concern immigration, and I think part of the problems that, you know, that Labour may be having here is about listening to people. Immigration is a real concern, and it's very fair for people to have a concern about the pace of immigration into this country. It has been, you know, perhaps too high for too long, and we need to get a handle on that. Obviously, the way we are members of the EU, we don't have adequate controls. You have people who can come here very easily tap into the welfare system. That's part of what the Prime Minister is trying to change. And I think those concerns are valid. People should be listened to. We are doing our best to address those concerns, acknowledge those concerns, and try and make a real change in these areas. And, you know, I think in Labour, as these reports are showing, historically have not done that and need to start listening to people.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why Labour did lose the election, Sarah Champion, because you weren't trusted on immigration?
I think, again, looking at my constituency and area, one of the reasons that people voted UKIP was because, you know, the Tory candidate turned up for the first time to the constituency on the night of the hustings. There was no sort of real campaigning done on the ground, so they weren't offered an alternative. So if you didn't want to vote Labour, you only had the option of UKIP. So I think it's more that the Tories have, well, basically turned their back on large swathes of the country, and I think that's something that they need to be addressing.
Is that a fair point, do you think? The Conservatives have just completely lost sight of many of the big urban areas?
No, I don't think that's right at all. I mean, you see from the Chancellor a huge focus on, you know, creating a northern economic powerhouse.
But you don't have many councillors in some of the inner cities, do you?
Well, that's exactly the work that we're building on. So I think this is a Chancellor who's more committed to the north, and he has come from just outside Manchester. It's a huge commitment to northern and urban cities, and they're all benefiting from that, this great wave of devolution. But I think this point about immigration is central, and I think people have a valid concern, and it's the right that we address it and we get better control of our immigration system. That's what the Prime Minister is trying to do in Europe, and that's absolutely the right thing to do.
Do you think Europe is as big an issue as many Conservatives think it is? Because your predecessor in Richmond, William Hague, fought an election on Europe about saving the pound and all that back in 2001, but he lost by a landslide, didn't he?
Yeah, well, I think that one of William's great achievements is ensuring that we never joined the single currency. And there were a lot of people, you know, some senior people in the Labour Party included, who wanted us to do that. I think it's all very apparent to everyone now that would have been an absolute disaster for this country. And, you know, it's one of William's great achievements that we had nothing to do with the single currency.
One of the things I think is quite interesting is where the UKIP do have a lot of influence is how they make other parties respond to them. So I think a lot of what we're seeing of the sort of the more extreme stuff coming out of the Tory party is actually them trying to flex and respond to the UKIP agenda. And, you know, from a Labour's point of view, I actually think it's good that UKIP have challenged us and are making us sort of review what we're doing now and, you know, not being complacent about anything from top to bottom, looking to make sure what we're doing is supporting the working people as we ought to be.
I just think on that point, I think that's exactly where you have a problem, and it's not an extreme right-wing. No, Labour as a party, it's not an extreme right-wing, agenda to be concerned about immigration. 80% of people in this country think that immigration needs to be controlled. Well, I think that's a fundamental part of our relationship with Europe, is not having adequate control over EU immigration. And I think, thinking that is an extreme niche right-wing agenda is missing the point. I mean, this is a widespread concern across the country, and unless we can change our relationship with Europe, we can't tackle immigration properly.
But before UKIP got hold of it and made it an issue, the Tory party was sort of complacently going on their own sort of path on this, whereas I think you are being much more responsive to the external pressures, and most of those are being driven by UKIP.
I think
so I don't think that they're a credible sort of party for coming into government. I don't see them as a threat that way, but I do think they are, you know, leading the narrative.
Well, I think we're being responsible to the people, and the people have a concern about immigration, and the people want a choice and a vote on Europe, and we've delivered that referendum, which I know Labour opposed originally, and now I think is in favour of having the referendum. I think that's absolutely the right thing to do.
In one word, should Labour's election review be made public?
Yes.
Good. We like brevity on this programme. Thank you very much for that. Let's get some more of the week's political news now. Larry Budd has our roundup in 60 seconds.
People living in rural areas in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire are not receiving their fair share of government money. That's according to the Beverley and Holderness MP Graham Stewart, who says the people living in the countryside are poorer on average than those living in cities, but still have to pay higher taxes for fewer local services.
The government's made progress in the last 5 years. We want to see it go further.
The Prime Minister has again defended the government's response to the Boxing Day floods across Yorkshire.
The money was distributed faster, the EA worked even harder and even more round the clock, but there are always lessons to learn to demonstrate that we want to get these communities back on their feet as quickly as possible.
And Chesterfield's Labour MP Toby Perkins has been calling for an English national anthem in place of the British national anthem, God Save the Queen. Jerusalem has been touted as one contender, and the MP himself had another suggestion.
I won't say which area it was that thought the most appropriate choice for an English national anthem should be Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now.
We'll discuss the anthem in a minute. Firstly, should rural areas get more government funding? Rishi Sunak.
Yes, I think historically rural areas have been underfunded, and it's not just in local government funding that Graham was talking about, it's in education and health. I think we've done a good job of understanding the drivers of urban deprivation. We've done a less good job of understanding, you know, the needs of rural areas. We have huge, sparse, populated areas which increase costs, and we also have very elderly populations which also increase costs, and we need to make sure we capture those right and fund those areas adequately.
Many people living in rural areas do not think they get good value for their taxes. Is that a fair point?
I think it is a fair point. I mean, if you look at things like transport, public transport, there's almost nothing in rural areas. But what I think, rather than sort of doing a rural areas get this much, urban areas get that much, we ought to be looking at need, because I know deprivation, particularly in sort of my constituency and similar constituencies, is ridiculously high, and we need to get some sort of compensation to deal with that.
Does England need its own national anthem? If so, what should it be, Sarah Champion?
I think it does, just because it seems very odd if England are playing Wales, that we use the British anthem and they use the Welsh one. And I have to say, I do love Jerusalem. I mean, it does move everyone, and, you know, it's got sort of good Labour roots to it as well.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, no, I think I agree with what Sarah said. So, apart from the Labour Party part, I think Jerusalem is for all of us. But, no, I think that's a very fair point. I think it was a very interesting debate, and it raises this question about, you know, fairness for England. I mean, we've had a lot of devolution to Scotland, and I think it's important that the English voice is heard, and if that voice is heard through the dulcet tones of Jerusalem, then all the better.
Well, we were going to finish on a song, but sadly we've run out of time. You'd be heartbroken about that. Thank you both for your time today.
Thank you.
Sarah Champion, Rishi Sunak. Thank you. And with that, we shall go back to Andrew Neil in London.